But one of the great pleasures I had at the first one held in Melbourne, which was actually the second convention, was a couple of fresh-faced young blokes had come down from Queensland to be at it. One of them was Bob Bruce, who still runs the Queensland Skeptics, and the other one was this young philosopher, fresh of face, dark of hair, pommy of accent, who was made very shortly thereafter into a life member because of his brilliant work on putting together Creationism and Australian Perspective as the co-editor. 20 years later, 21 years later, he's still with us, not so fresh-faced, hair's a little tinge of grey in it, still the same brilliant and thoughtful speaker he always was. It's a great pleasure to introduce Martin Bridgstock.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we've had the mandatory technical glitch now, so that gives me two choices. I can either talk at about 20% faster than my normal rate, or else I can run over into question time. I'm going to try to do a little bit of both so as not to inconvenience you too much. I am not, I promise, going to rabbit on about my skepticism course. I've done a lot of rabbiting on about that, and I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do today is something very new. I suspect that nobody has ever talked on this particular topic before. It's very new. I think it could be very important. That's the B word, and I'm not going to use it. I think it could be important. You'll gather from the way I talk about it that it's very much a work in progress. So I'm inviting you to think along with me. And if at any stage your thinking departs from mine, that's fine. But at least you'll know what I'm thinking about. And I would like to start with a truly horrifying experience, which still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. I teach on a number of courses at Griffith University, and one of them is a course called Life, the Universe and Everything, which deals with the big questions of science. And I go in and I do the first section on the first scientific breakthroughs, how we discovered that the Earth was not at the centre of the universe, but in fact orbited the Sun. And I talk about Copernicus, and I talk about Galileo, and I talk about Isaac Newton, and most people find it very interesting. But one time I delivered this lecture, and a young woman followed me back to my room afterwards, took out a pencil and paper, sat down. Now, she said. And then she asked me the question. With an air of getting down to business, she said, "Now tell me, does the Earth go round the Sun, or does the Sun go round the Earth?" My expression betrayed me. If you look in the conference book, you will see an expression closely similar to the one I had at that time. Glazed eyes, half-open jaw, slack mouth. I really did look as if somebody had hit me over the head with a rather large hammer. Well, I didn't betray this. I told her the answer, and she noted down the information for future reference. Now, this young woman was not stupid, I stress that. She saw my expression, she correctly interpreted my expression, and she explained the situation. She explained that she was a marketing student, and so she didn't know this kind of thing. And what was more, all her friends were marketing students, and they didn't know either. Now, you may be thinking at this stage that Griffith University's Department of Commerce and Marketing is a black hole of cosmological ignorance, and you might perhaps be right, but there was a simpler reason, I think. This student came from a nearby Asian country, a large nearby Asian country, which I rather think narrows it down to one. The story of Galileo and his persecution and his telescope and so on is very much part of our culture. Kids learn about it, you read stories about it, you see documentaries about it and so on. It's a part of our culture. Presumably, it's not a part of theirs. So it's very easy to be smug about these people. But we shouldn't be too smug. This gentleman on the screen at the moment is a skeptic, and you can gather from his expression what he is feeling. But no, he has not seen a ghost, and he has not learned that his companion for the evening is a raving fundamentalist who is out to save his soul. He is, in fact, looking at some statistics. I'm going to start off by pointing out the true horror of the current skeptic's position, and then I'm going to try to suggest some useful approaches which might help us as skeptics to be more effective in the future. I'm going to make a couple of assumptions straight away. First of all, I'm going to assume that most of the audience are skeptics. It is quite possible that in our midst There is the occasional creationist or clairvoyant who has come along to see what the enemy looks like. Well, if they're here, let me reassure them. Skeptics are nice people, and even if you declare your true opinions, you will get out of here in one piece. You're in no danger whatever. But I'm going to assume the vast majority of you are skeptics, and that is at the basis that you think that claims of the paranormal should not be believed just because they're claimed, but the evidence for them should be demanded, and if the evidence isn't adequate, then the claims should not be believed. That I regard as being the basis of skepticism. Now let's have a look at some statistics. This is a Gallup poll from the United States last year. They asked a cross-section of Americans whether they believed in 10 paranormal beliefs. And 73% of them said that they believed in at least one of the 10. 1% of the respondents believed in all 10. These are things like psychokinesis, ghosts, ESP, and so on. Now, Barry Williams often talks about the editor of a certain Queensland supernatural magazine, where he publishes lots and lots of wildly conflicting supernatural claims and believes all of them. Well, judging by this, he's in good company. If there are 300 million Americans, 1% of Americans believe all 10 supernatural claims. That's 3 million Americans who are on the same line as the editor of Nexus magazine. Now, this is slightly down from the similar poll in 2001, but there's a statistical error there. We can't say with any reasonable certainty that, in fact, belief in the paranormal is declining in the United States. It's, as you can see, a very large figure indeed. The huge majority of Americans are quite prepared to say that they believe in one or other paranormal belief. Now, it's very tempting after this to feel smug, those Americans who have all those funny beliefs. Except that in 2001, Reader's Digest carried out a poll of paranormal beliefs in Australia. What did they come up with? Well, they found that 80% of Australians are prepared to say that some people have psychic powers or ESP. 72% believe that houses can be haunted. 76% believe they can sense when someone is watching them. Well, let's do a little experiment right now. Let's do an informal opinion poll right at this moment. Summon up your courage. Who here believes that some people have psychic powers or ESP? We have 1 or 2 believers. Congratulations, you're a brave person. And who here believes that houses can be haunted? We have 1 or 2 believers. I can tell you, therefore, that overwhelmingly this group is not representative of Australian opinion or American opinion. Now, I've done some polling among my students. It's very tempting to think that education is the panacea, that if we just teach people about science, then that will somehow make them more skeptical. It doesn't really work that way. I presented my students with 15 paranormal beliefs and asked them which ones they believed in, and nearly 60% of them believed in one or more of these paranormal propositions. The most common were ESP, telepathy, ghosts and hauntings. This to me is rather disconcerting. If I go into a room, something like this, where there's, say, a couple of hundred students, it means that about 60% of them, about 120, have some paranormal beliefs. And there's a small group who believe in 12 or 14 of those paranormal beliefs. There is also a contingent of 10 or 15 creationists sitting in there, loathing me. And I find myself looking around at the student faces and thinking, which ones are which? And of course, I can't tell. So here's my first point, and it's a rather depressing one in many ways. We skeptics are greatly outnumbered. We are outnumbered by hundreds to one, possibly by thousands to one. Here is a skeptic who is contemplating the enormous armies of unbelievers. I won't conjecture as to whether he dived into a barrel of liquid to get out of the way, or whether he dived into an empty barrel and in his fear filled it with liquid. No comment. But either way, we have to agree this particular skeptic has adopted an inappropriate solution to the particular problem. But he's right to be concerned. We are massively, overwhelmingly outnumbered. What should we think or do about this? Well, since we're so outnumbered, we have to use our resources wisely. What we do count as much as it possibly can. We have to make our presence count to the absolute utmost. If you want to use a boring term for it, you could call it skeptical policy, if you like. What should we do in order to maximize our own effectiveness? I'm finding these microphones very irritating. Anyone else finding them irritating? Sorry, which one? The body mic doesn't work. There's a paranormal influence that is... It's erratic. Let me move around. Right. If I stay in one particular position, it'll work. Okay. So you can call this, if you like, skeptical policy. It works sometimes. Okay. I'm going to now address that's my first point, the first big point I want to make. Skepticism is a small minority movement. We're no longer burned at the stake or hung, drawn and quartered or tortured because we're skeptics. But nonetheless, we're still a tiny minority. And we have to work out the best ways that we can make our activities count. What I'm going to suggest today is next 2 possible ways that we can maximize our effectiveness. First of all, how do we decide what issues to address? There are thousands of paranormal claims being made. My students every year bring me more and more paranormal claims that I've never heard of. They propagate on the internet like rabbits. It's quite amazing. So that's one question. And the second question is, how should we treat paranormal believers? What is the best way to approach them and to deal with their claims? Let's start with the first. How do we decide what issues to address? Well, here's a little skeptical alien trying to work out which paranormal claims most merit investigation. Eric von Daniken, creation science, quack health cures, complementary medicine, therapeutic touch, the Mozart effect. There are thousands of them. I confess, generally speaking, we don't give this issue much thought. I started it by being a skeptic, by getting involved with the work of Eric von Daniken. I read a couple of books on it, realized here was a very good little talk I could do debunking him, did that, and at the end of the talk, to one particular group, I made a comment about creation science. And sure enough, there was a creationist in the audience, and he later on showed me some magazines. So I had a look at the creationist magazines, and I came to the conclusion after analyzing them they were nonsense, so I got involved in that controversy. Things happen without being planned. My point is perhaps we should think about which paranormal claims we should analyze. If we do decide to do this, what criteria should we use? What's important to analyze? What isn't? Well, here are 3 suggestions, and I'll just run through them, and then I'll make comments on every one. First of all, some paranormal claims are a clear threat to our understanding of the universe. That is, they're a threat to science. In some way or other, they threaten to undercut the basis of science. I'm not claiming that science is any kind of a perfect institution or that it always works well, or even that its results are always beneficial for us. I am saying that by and large, science is an activity and an institution which is very well worth keeping. And therefore, paranormal claims which seek to undercut it should at least be closely examined. Secondly, there are some paranormal activities which directly cause great suffering. The obvious one which comes to mind here is certain forms of alternative health cures. Peter Bowditch, as well as wearing those amazing shirts, also has a website on which he details cases in which children, for example, have died because their parents have refused medical treatment which could have cured them, and sometimes those children die horribly. Thirdly, some paranormal claims are dangerous because they acquire great power. Either politicians begin to push them, or somebody wealthy begins to channel large amounts of money their way. And what I'm going to suggest is that if any or all of those characteristics are attached to a paranormal belief, alarm lights ought to go off in Skeptics Central, and we ought to start to think, is this claim in fact justified, or is it not? Now, a danger to science. These are just my opinions, and I may be wrong. Some claims made by paranormalists are less dangerous to science than others. The Loch Ness Monster, for instance, doesn't actually contradict science at all. If Nessie were to surface tomorrow and turn out to be, let us say, an ichthyosaur, it wouldn't actually contradict any scientific principles. We know some creatures have survived over many millions of years. It's possible. Parapsychologists want, many of them anyway, to be scientists. They try to do scientific experiments. And so they're not a direct danger to science. And thirdly, poor old seriology, crop circles. Well, they were trying to study them scientifically, putting forward theories and trying to test them out before two elderly hoaxers in Britain revealed that, in fact, the whole field was completely bogus. So there are some areas of the paranormal which, in my view, are not dangerous to science. Ones which are dangerous to science, well, you can bracket the first two together, creation science and intelligent design. I take it we all know now that intelligent design is simply a mask for creation science. It's another attempt by extreme fundamentalist Christians to get their religious views treated as science. It is appallingly dangerous to science because what they want to do, and you can find literature on this, is very simply to take the methods of science and to replace them by their own assumptions. And their own assumptions, of course, are religious beliefs about the creation of the universe. Another one, which is defunct as far as I know, is Aryan science, which again was appallingly dangerous. It was propagated by Hitler. And the idea was that science could only be done by Aryans, that Jewish people could not do science, and therefore any science done by a Jewish person had to be rejected. That, of course, wiped out quite large parts of German science, since Jewish people do make an enormous contribution to science, generally far out of proportion to their numbers. So those are simply my opinions. If we start to say, well, if certain paranormal claims are more dangerous to science than others, perhaps that's the kind of way we might think about them. Secondly, of course, some paranormal claims directly affect the lives and welfare of people. Alternative medicine, as opposed to complementary medicine, perhaps, that is, which seeks to supplant conventional medicine. Now, conventional medicine isn't always right, but increasingly there is an insistence that modern medicine, the remedies have to be tested with proper clinical trials. This is not the case for alternative medicines, and therefore these may perhaps endanger the lives of many people. Then there are people who make money from people when they're at their most vulnerable. There was a very disturbing study which appeared in Skeptical Inquirer a while ago by Richard Wiseman, the British skeptic. He trained some actors to act the part of very distressed people who had had a bereavement or the breakup of a long-term relationship, and they went to see psychics and clairvoyants. And in almost every case, the psychics and clairvoyants charged a very reasonable fee for the first consultation. And when they realized how vulnerable these people were, then they started to offer other services to relieve their grief for a much, much larger fee. That is preying on people's vulnerability, and perhaps we ought to concentrate on that. Then there are pseudoscientists which affect vital industries. And the one I think of in particular is Lysenkoism, which is the notorious pseudo-biology which flourished under Stalin in the Soviet Union. Among other things, it denied Mendelian genetics, it denied evolution, and it had direct implications for Soviet agriculture. One of the reasons why for decades the Soviet Union couldn't feed its own people was because Lysenkoism had made such a terrible mess of its agricultural system. Finally, some paranormal beliefs are very dangerous, and I show here the picture of two of our least favourite people from the 20th century, Adolf and Joe. Some pseudosciences receive powerful political backing. Aryan science was complete nonsense. It only achieved any currency at all because it was backed by Hitler. Lysenkoism was complete nonsense. It only achieved any prominence because it was backed by Stalin, and in both cases it did monstrous damage. This makes them extremely dangerous. So again, when a paranormal belief achieves powerful backing, perhaps we skeptics should be very alert. So that's the first suggestion I want to make, that we should regard paranormal beliefs as especially dangerous if they're threatening the nature of science, if they are directly responsible for human suffering, or if they are backed by powerful, organized interests. That's as far as I've got in thinking along that line. My second approach is, what about different paranormalists, different people who advocate paranormal beliefs? Well, here is our gentleman from the barrel again, and this time he's in a slightly more hopeful mood. There are differences between paranormalists. They're not by any means all the same. And I confess I've been going on a jag reading this bloke's work, Thomas Babington Macaulay, who lived and wrote in the 19th century. He's a historian, a Whig, which means he's a progressive in the British Parliament. And he had a brilliant insight into two of his contemporaries. Now, this has nothing to do with the paranormal, except the insight he had, I think, can be transferred over to paranormalists. The two people he wrote about at some length were one of his fellow Whigs, the politician and philosopher Edmund Burke, who was one of the most brilliant political philosophers of all time, and a poet laureate, Robert Southey, who I confess I'd never heard to up till that time, which says something about his poetry. Now, what Macaulay had to say about Burke was he conceded his brilliance, he conceded his superb analytical mind, but he criticised him, saying that he chose his positions, his views on different things, on the basis of whim, on the basis of completely irrational factors. But then once he'd picked them, then his full brilliance, his full genius would be devoted to defending those positions. So as Macaulay says, he picked his positions like a fanatic, then he defended them like a philosopher, or as we might say today, like a lawyer. And Burke himself admitted this, that he didn't in fact rationally think out his positions. By contrast, of Robert Southey, Macaulay says, reason has no place either as a sovereign or a slave. Next, I'm going to do something which always irritates students, and I apologise for it, but I can't resist putting this quote up on the screen and reading it all out because it is so marvellous. It's a detailed commentary on the thought, if you can call it that, of Robert Southey. It has never occurred to him that there is a difference between assertion and demonstration, that a rumour does not always prove a fact, that a single fact, when proved, is hardly foundation enough for a theory, that two contradictory propositions cannot be undeniable truths, whatever the editor of Nexus thinks, and that to beg a question is not the way to settle it, or that when an objection is raised, it ought to be met with something more convincing than scoundrel and blockhead. Now, some of those errors of thought are almost precisely what you find in paranormalist thinking and paranormalist writing. Now, neither of these people were particularly pro-paranormal as far as we know, but there are some useful parallels. Some paranormalists adopt some very strange idea and then defend it with great intellect and with knowledge. And often they're very capable of doing this. For others, and I'll call them the Southies, reason has no place at all. They don't know why they believe what they believe, and they really have no intellectual method of defending it. Now, the bad news, if you think this way, is this. The Burkes, the people who have the methods of defending their beliefs, there is no easy way of dealing with them. I'm thinking in particular of some of the glib, smooth proponents of creation science who can produce all kinds of philosophical and pseudo-scientific arguments. They are very formidable indeed, the best of them, and very hard to defeat in debate. So it takes a great deal of time and effort and determination from skeptics, and yet it has to be done. There have to be skeptics who know as much about the area of the paranormalist Burkes as the Burkes themselves do, and can point out what's wrong with their arguments. And it can be very dangerous. It really is like sometimes going into a tournament, facing people who are every bit as determined, every bit as well armed as you are, and can be very, very hard to win. That's the bad news. The good news is this. Almost certainly among paranormalists, the Southies are much more common than the Burkes. What I mean by that is that people who have not got that many intellectual tools to defend their paranormal positions are much more common than those who have. And the recipe for Southies is quite different. For the most part, they don't even need to be addressed at all. Because if we can get the facts about paranormal claims and skeptical ideas out to the general public, the Southies can be handled by other people. Just imagine in staff common rooms in schools, in workplaces, in churches. The Southies are putting forward irrational views. If we can put into the hands of people all around them alternative views, alternative arguments, then you don't need to combat the Southies. That was one of the reasons why the book that Barry mentioned earlier, Skepticism, an Australian Perspective, which Dr. Ken Smith and I edited back in the 1980s, it cost $5. The aim is to make it very cheap so that in every school staff room, in every workplace throughout Queensland where creation science was very strong, there would be somebody who could get the book and could argue back against the local creationists. And it seemed to work. A point which follows from that is that skeptics, since we're so outnumbered, we shouldn't waste our time arguing with individual Southies. When publicity first went out back in 2001 about the course I run on skepticism, I received 2 CDs from God. This is quite an experience. They arrived through the post from a gentleman in a northern Queensland town who said that God regularly spoke to him and he had put it down on paper, what God had said. Well, I glanced at them. They were frankly total drivel. I didn't bother to reply. If you let yourself be tied down by that kind of thing, as a skeptic, you're wasting your time. So my points simply are these, and I hope you'll agree that what I've said today is something very new. We skeptics are grossly outnumbered by paranormal believers, certainly hundreds to one, possibly thousands to one. We're not persecuted as we used to be, but nonetheless, our position is still a very weak one. So we need to make our efforts count to the utmost. And I suggest this means that, first of all, we select the areas of the paranormal that we get involved in. It shouldn't be just a whimsical choice. It should be a considered choice. And 3 possible criteria which we might use are whether it endangers science, whether the paranormal beliefs cause direct suffering, or whether they are backed by powerful interests. And if one or more of those are so, then perhaps that might be something that we want to become involved in. And among paranormalists, we can distinguish those who do have very strong defense systems. I've called them the Burks here. The people who have very strong methods of defending their particular paranormal views. And there is no other way of arguing with a Burke except to know as much as they know and then being prepared to point out the flaws in their arguments. But for the Southies, what we need is a broad system of education to propagate skeptical principles, skeptical beliefs, so that everywhere, every school, every workplace, every church, there are people who understand what skeptical positions are, and also who know how to gain the kind of materials that skeptical investigations produce. Okay, last slide, and this is by way of an end note. It should be pretty clear, I think, by now that I see skepticism as a good deal more than a hobby or a pastime. I see skepticism as an important part of our civilization. There is nothing whatever guaranteed about the future progress of science. There have been cases in the past where areas of the world have been good at science and then have lost that supremacy. It could happen to us, and it could happen indeed to the whole world. Now, Paul Kurtz, the American skeptic, who's really one of the intellectual godfathers of the modern skeptical movement, recently called for a new enlightenment. I think he's being too modest. The initial enlightenment was a movement among a very few intellectual people, the handful of people at that time who had the ability to read and to understand the issues and had the leisure to think about them. We need far more than that. Skeptical principles, skeptical understandings have got to be imparted to the whole of our Western society. And I hope that in the process of doing that, we can help to create a happier world. Okay, that's your lot.
So, do you think that there might be some carryover from people raised in strong religious beliefs, that they take that into their feelings on paranormal? And as a society, we should be pursuing religious beliefs much more than we do.
I've got mixed feelings about that, very mixed feelings. On the one hand, yes, sure, people who are brought up in extreme fundamentalist backgrounds in particular, there are no doubt at all that they are locked inside the fundamentalist system, and many of them find it very difficult to get out of it. And therefore, of course, they are opposed to what they see as the dreadful, godless, evolutionary, atheistic methods. Personally, I don't want particularly to get involved in religion more than I have to. I think it's an enormous new battle. As those statistics show, we are grossly outnumbered already by the believers in ordinary paranormal beliefs. You take on the religious people as well, and I think in practical terms you're doomed.
Martin, have you got the practical action points we can all go and follow next week?
No, I haven't. As I said at the start, this is a work in progress. I'm thinking it out, working it out. Now, if there was a reaction here today, this is rubbish, and here's the reasons A, B, C why it's rubbish, I would have probably gone away and quietly burnt it all. If I don't get that reaction, I shall carry on thinking about it, start to write about it, start to develop that kind of action plan. What I've laid today are what I think are some kind of principles about what skeptics might do. Just the first step, the foundation.
Yes, here.
Look, my personal experience is, of course, that while you run into people every day who may hold one or more beliefs in the paranormal, the vast majority of them aren't important. And that in this country, at least in Australia, the really important issues, which may be the ones that you highlighted, such as creationism and things like that, we actually aren't outnumbered hundreds or thousands to one. And in actual fact, on the really important issues, in this country at least, we have a great deal of support. They might not be actively supporters of skepticism, but inherently in some of the big major issues, such as the more weirder religions and things like that, they're on our side. I don't feel as though I'm horribly outnumbered on most of the fundamental issues with regards to believing the paranormal. If someone wants to believe in, ghosts or something like that, I don't see that as a threat. As long as their beliefs in the paranormal don't go beyond that and into something which I would consider dangerous to me or to the society I live in.
You may very well be right, and I think that point of view is every bit as reasonable as my pessimistic one. The counter-argument to that is the argument which was put forward by the 19th century British philosopher W.K. Clifford, in which he said that if you hold some paranormal beliefs, that is, some beliefs which are not justified by the evidence, then it is the danger that it will corrupt your whole judgment system. Because if you hold one belief, there's a danger you may hold another, and then another. And thereby your entire system of standards of deciding right from wrong may be corrupted. Now, that's debatable, and I can see that you're every bit as likely to be right as me. I hope you are, because it's a lot more optimistic.
Is postmodernism a form of the paranormal?
I would say no, it isn't. Although, of course, since postmodernism says that science is only one belief among a large number of beliefs, therefore, of course, paranormal beliefs by implication are every bit as valid as scientific beliefs. So it's a kind of rationale for some paranormal beliefs. But actually, there was a gentleman over here who put his hand up first. Did you see him, Barry, over here somewhere? Yes.
What is your position where somebody has a view about something paranormal and gives them comfort? Where it allows them to feel better about their world. For example, they're communicating with a lost relative or something. Is it really our job to work hard to disabuse them of that comfort?
I take that point completely, and I can add to that. I teach this course on the paranormal, and sometimes the effects, the shock that it has on students when they realise, they look at their previous beliefs and they realise that those beliefs are not justified. Or, and this is even more distressing, when they look at beliefs of other people in their family and they suddenly realise that something they'd accepted completely for years, dear God, that belief's crazy. Why does that person believe that belief and yet she's so close to me? Yeah, so I do feel very responsible for that. On the other hand, there is no doubt that some of these paranormal beliefs do terrible harm. I think perhaps as skeptics what we have to do is to winnow out the beliefs which are dangerous from the ones which aren't.
Yes, Martin, you're really presenting the kind of alternative beliefs as if they're adopted really as a sort of choice between being orthodox or rational. I suspect an awful lot of people who go to them do it out of reaction against a scientific and technological culture with which they can already not cope.
Yeah.
Therefore, would a campaign of skeptics against them not in fact reinforce them in that kind of isolation?
Yeah, that's one of the great problems of modern science. I mean, science is the biggest edifice human beings have ever constructed. The problem is you can't see it. Nobody can see all of it. Non-scientists can't see any of it. And there it is, driving away, transforming the world all the time in ways that most of us can't really understand. I'd certainly agree there's a problem there. That's why I'm really in favour, above all, of targeting those paranormal beliefs which are dangerous or which can be dangerous, and therefore focusing a lot more on those. I don't mind if people believe in the Loch Ness Monster. Good luck to them. I hope it's true. I'm rooting for Nessie myself.
What danger do you see of these Southies using the internet to find out what the Burkes are arguing? I mean, that's pretty much how skeptics learn. Surely they're going to use the same tactics.
Yes, they are, and they do. Quite often you find that paranormal movements consist of a few Burkes who are very knowledgeable about the area and can justify the area, and the very much larger number of people who are not able to criticize those beliefs and who just follow them. So yeah, many paranormal movements do consist of both at the same time. And yeah, the internet does provide a way by which paranormalists get together and share their strange beliefs. There's no doubt at all that happens.
Don't you think it would be a better name to call the skeptics the critical thinkers? Wouldn't it give us more credibility?
I'm not opposed to that. I regard skepticism as being a subset of critical thinking. If you look on the website of either SciCop, the American Skeptics, or ours, it defines skepticism as being the responsible scientific investigation of claims of the paranormal. So that's quite specific. Critical thinking is a more general term which applies to many more things. My point is, I'm a little bit worried that we seem to be losing our focus and saying, well, let's be skeptical about everything. Okay, but then we haven't won the basic battle. We still haven't dented paranormal belief.
Martin, thank you very much. You may be 20 years on from the last time.